Next is the state's theories on how, when, and why this occurred and the defence's rebuttal to that. We've gone over this mostly in episodes 1 to 3, so I'm going to skip over a lot of it that you've already heard, but the trial court itself concluded that the state had failed to present any evidence showing how it was committed or where the crime was committed. There was no physical evidence, they say, to support the theory. According to detectives Skelterty and Hendy, despite thorough searches of the home lasting numerous days and began on the same day Lacey went missing, police found nothing to suggest a crime. Officer Letzinger noticed there was no signs of foul play at the Peterson home, nor did Karen Service, the Petersons' next door neighbour, hear screams or other suspicious noises coming from the house on the night of the 23rd or the morning of the 24th. Finally, there were no defensive marks or wounds on Scott at all. Even the potential evidence police found had no connection at all to Lacey's disappearance. The state's own criminalist, Pin Kayo, admitted that nothing of evidentiary value was found on the mops or bucket that were found at the scene, neither blood, tissue, or anything that supported the state's theory that Scott used it to clean up a crime scene. Detective Grogan himself admitted that although the state had collected pillowcases at the scene, it had elected not to test even a single one. And state criminalist Kayo added that the state did not test any of the pillows either. Thus, Detective Grogan conceded that there was no evidence that shows smothering, strangulation, or asphyxiation. If you remember, the state next theorised that Scott used his truck to take the body to his warehouse. Once there, he transferred the body into his boat, hiding it under a tarp. To support this part of the theory, the state offered demonstrative evidence that Kim Fulbright, a pregnant woman who worked for the prosecutor's office, could fit into the toolbox in the back of Scott's truck as well as the boat. But according to Detective Hendy and state criminalist Kayo, there was a more immediate problem with this part of the state's theory. Scott's truck contained no evidence that it had been used to transport a body. There was no blood, urine, or other tissue found in his truck or toolbox. None of Lacey's hair was in his truck or toolbox. The tarps found in the back of Scott's truck, which the state theorised Scott used to wrap the body in, contained no relevant evidence whatsoever. There was no blood, urine, or other tissue found on either tarp, nor was there any evidence that a body had been at the warehouse. The state, however, did have evidence of concrete dust on Scott's trailer. There was one homemade anchor found inside the boat. The prosecution relied heavily on the notion that Scott's trailer had been used to pour additional circular concrete anchors, as evidenced by what the prosecutor perceived to be circular shapes on the trailer bed in the midst of concrete rubble. According to the prosecution, this was evidence that Scott made 5 concrete anchors, 4 of which were used to weigh down the body and submerge it in the bay. The state searched the bay for weeks and weeks looking for the anchors, but found nothing. Police used dive boats, sonar, a special underwater search vehicle, and specialised dive teams from the FBI, Contra Costa County, Marin County, and San Francisco County. Because they found nothing at all, the state was left with pictures of concrete dust to prove that 5 anchors had been made. But if the state's theory was right, then Scott meticulously cleaned his home, truck and boat of any evidence tying him to the crime, but left the mess from making the concrete anchors in plain view for police to find. This is even odder in light of the fact that Scott plainly had time to clean the warehouse if he had wanted to, as Detective Mansfield, Wall and Grogan themselves conceded. Scott was at the warehouse for an hour that morning, assembling a tool and surfing the internet. According to criminalist Kayo, there was no blood, urine or other tissue found in the boat itself. The only notable evidence was Lacey's hair fragment on a pair of pliers in the boat. The prosecutor relied on this evidence to argue that these pliers were used in this crime, but the forensic evidence simply did not support this position either. Thus, state expert Sarah Yoshida examined the pliers and testified that they were so rusted that based on their appearance, the pliers had not recently been used. Ms. Yoshida also confirmed not only that the pliers had no visible signs of blood or tissue, but that as with the pillow and pillowcases, the state had elected to do no further testing on the pliers. Moreover, Peggy O'Donnell and Rosemary Ruiz, 2 women who worked in the same warehouse as Scott, had both seen Lacey at Scott's warehouse around December 20th, 2002. This testimony became significant when the state's own hair expert Ron Oswalt explained the concept of secondary transfer, through which the hair fragment may have fallen in the boat at that time or been transferred from Scott to the boat. The defence obtained the same make and model as Scott's boat and performed a demonstration near Brooks Island, where the state theorised Lacey's body had been pushed overboard. The demonstration involved a mannequin the exact weight of Lacey, 153 pounds, which was weighted down with 4 anchors, and a person weighted down so that he was the same weight as Scott Peterson. The demonstration was done at the same time of day as the state theorised, 12:30 to 1 p.m, and it was filmed. The boat capsized, but when the state objected to the evidence, the trial court excluded it. Evidence as to when the crime occurred. As noted, the state initially theorised Scott killed Lacey on the night of December 23rd or the early morning hours of December 24th. In closing argument, however, the prosecutor would concede that based on the evidence he could not prove when the crime occurred. With respect, the prosecutor was far too modest. In fact, the evidence suggested quite plainly that Lacey was not killed on December 23rd. Computer records from the Peterson home computer show that someone was on the internet between 8:40am and 8:45am on the morning of December 24th, looking at a garden weather vane, a Gap Pro Fleece scarf, and a sunflower umbrella stand. While it is certainly conceivable that Scott was looking for these items, it seems far more likely that Lacey was searching for these items. After all, as several prosecution witnesses noted, it was Lacey who had a sunflower tattoo. But there's more. Police also found Lacey's curling iron out on the bathroom counter. Margarita Nava, who cleaned the Petersons' home on the 23rd, confirmed that when she cleaned on the 23rd, she put everything away on the bathroom counter. While it is conceivable that Lacey would have used the curling iron to curl her hair just before going to sleep on December 23rd, the more likely scenario is that she used the iron to curl her hair on the morning of December 24th. Thus, the fact that the curling iron was out on the 24th also undercuts any suggestion that Lacey was killed on December 23rd. Moreover, when Lacey's body was found in April of 2003, she was wearing tan pants. But Amy recalled that on the night of December 23rd, Lacey was wearing a black blouse with cream polka dots or little flowers and cream-coloured pants. Amy later saw these clothes at Lacey's house when she did a walk through the place. Thus, if Lacey was killed on the 23rd, it meant that someone had changed her clothes after her death. Thus, the prosecutor's concession that he could not prove when the crime occurred was clever, but too modest. In fact, the evidence suggests Lacey was not killed on December 23rd. Instead, the crime occurred on December 24th. This date is significant and explains the prosecutor's attempt to include December 23rd as a possible date for the crime. Sometime after 10:30 on the morning of December 24th, 2002, the Medina house across the street from Lacey and Scott was burglarized. Stephen Todd was arrested for the Medina burglary, according to a declaration which the state itself prepared. Several weeks after Lacey's disappearance, Lieutenant Xavier Aponte, a guard at the California Rehabilitation Center in Norco, California, reported a call he had monitored between inmate Sean Tenbrink and his brother Adam Tenbrink. During the call, Adam said his friend Stephen Todd admitted Lacey saw him burglarizing the Medina home on December 24th, 2002. Aponte said he taped this conversation but then lost it. Of course, if Lieutenant Aponte was correct and Lacey saw Todd burglarizing the Medina house after 10:30 on December 24th, then Lacey was alive when Scott left that morning and he is innocent. Moreover, neighbour Diane Jackson told police she saw the Medina burglary on December 24th. She saw 3 men outside the home removing a safe. In front of the house, she saw a van which she described as an older model, tan or light brown. Detective Cloward also received a call from Ton Harshman, reporting that on December 28, 2002, he saw a woman fitting Lacey's description urinating by the side of the road next to a van and then being pushed into the van. It was also notable that around the time of Lacey's disappearance, she owned an expensive Croton watch inherited from her grandmother. Although the watch was never found in Lacey's belongings after she disappeared, a Croton watch was pawned at a pawn shop in Modesto on December 31st, 2002, several days after she went missing. The pawn shop slip included a thumbprint of the person who pawned the item. The print did not belong to Scott. The state, however, never sought the watch itself, and the defence was unable to recover it because the pawn shop owner did not comply with the subpoena, and the person who bought the watch refused to sell it at the time of the crime. As discussed above, the time of the crime ultimately became the critical disputed issue at trial. The state's theory was that Lacey was killed before Scott left for Berkeley. The defence theory was that Lacey was still alive when Scott left the house that morning. The state has never disputed that if, in fact, Lacey was at home and alive after Scott left that morning, Scott is innocent. In an effort to undercut the defence theory, the state offered evidence that if Scott was telling the truth and Lacey was alive when he left the house, there was only a 10-minute window for Lacey to have been abducted by someone else. The state's theory was relatively simple and depended on two pieces of evidence. First, the state sought to determine a time by which Scott left the house. Of course, Scott told police that he left home after seeing a meringue segment during the Martha Stewart show. Martha Stewart discussed meringue at 9:48 a.m. To try and prove Scott's departure time more precisely, the state presented testimony from investigator Jacobson, who reviewed Scott's cell phone records and corresponding cell site information. These records show that on December 24, 2002, at 10:08 a.m, Scott made a 1 minute and 21 second call, which started at the 1250 Brighton cell tower and ended at the 10th and D cell tower. Several test calls by Jacobson showed that if Jacobson started a call in the Peterson driveway and drove towards Scott warehouse, the call would register on the same cell towers as Scott's call had registered on the 24th. So the state's theory was that at 10:08 a.m, when this call was made, Scott began driving from his home to his warehouse. The second piece of evidence on which the state relied was the testimony of Peterson neighbour Karen Service. As noted previously, Service testified that she found Mackenzie, the Peterson's dog, outside at 10:18 a.m. In closing argument, the state put these two pieces of evidence together to argue that if Scott was telling the truth that Lacey was alive when he left the house at 10:08 a.m. and Service found Mackenzie at 10:18, Lacey would have had to have been abducted in the 10-minute window between these two times. The prosecution argued that for Scott to be believed, Lacey gets abducted, the dog comes home and has to be found by Karen's Service, all in 10 minutes, all in a 10-minute window. This was even more unlikely, the prosecutor explained, because Scott and Lacey were wearing black pants when he left home. Because Lacey was ultimately found in tan pants, Lacey would have had to change her pants in that 10-minute window as well. According to the prosecutor, there was simply not enough time for this to have happened, therefore Scott Peterson was lying. The theory is quite clever, but it rests on a basic assumption which the evidence simply does not support. The state relies on this argument to rebut the defence theory that Lacey was alive when Scott left by assuming that when Karen's Service found Mackenzie outside, Lacey had already been abducted and or killed. In fact, not only did the state never offer any evidence to support this assumption, but the evidence which does exist directly undercuts it. After Service found Mackenzie, she put the dog in the Petersons' backyard. Service herself admitted that she did not check to see if anyone was home. Not only could Lacey have simply been in the house at the time, but Service herself conceded that she had found Mackenzie out loose in the neighbourhood on prior occasions. Of course, Service's admission that she had found Mackenzie outside on other occasions undercuts any suggestion that Mackenzie being outside meant that Lacey Peterson had already been killed. But there was substantially more. Service was not the only witness to testify about Mackenzie. Postman and prosecution witness Russell Graybill recalled Mackenzie being loose in the front of the house when he came to deliver mail on other days. Pool cleaner, prosecution witness Michael Amelia, who cleaned the Peterson's pool every week, testified that when he arrived each week, Mackenzie was generally outside in the backyard. Lacey was usually in the house and would come out occasionally. Police officers testified Mackenzie was outside in the backyard on various dates when they came by the house. Sharon Roker testified that Mackenzie spent significant time outside and only occasionally came into the house. All this evidence is particularly important in light of Service's own admission that when she found Mackenzie on December 24th, the gate to the Peterson backyard was open. The fact of the matter is that Mackenzie could simply have been put in the backyard with the gate having been accidentally left open, as the evidence showed had happened on numerous occasions. In short, the record shows Mackenzie spent significant time outside the house, both in the front and backyards, while Lacey was in the house, and when service found Mackenzie on December 24th, the backyard gate was open. The simplest explanation for Mackenzie being outside on December 24th is that, like all the other times Mackenzie was outside, he simply wandered out the open gate. The state's suggestion that service's discovery of Mackenzie outside the house at 10:18 meant that Lacey had already been abducted or killed ascribes a significance to Mackenzie's location that not only ignores service's testimony, but the testimony of Graybill, Amelia, Sharon Roker, and numerous police officers as well. Evidence as to why the crime occurred. In criminal cases, the state need not prove motive in order to convict, but in this case, the state nevertheless sought to explain why a man with no prior criminal history, nor history of domestic violence, would suddenly kill his wife and unborn child. As the prosecutor explained to the jury in closing arguments, the state's theory with respect to motive was threefold. 1. Scott killed Lacey for financial reasons. 2. Scott killed Lacey because he did not want to be a father. And 3. Scott killed Lacey because he wanted freedom to pursue other relationships. As noted, the defense theory was that Scott had no motive at all to kill Lacey and did not do so. To support its financial motive theory, the state presented evidence from Gary Nenas. Nenas was an internal auditor for the city of Modesto who was asked by the state to review the Petersons' financial records. Based on the financial statements provided by the state, Nenas concluded that 70% of Scott's income went to fixed debt of credit card bills, mortgages, and car loans. This did not include food, gas, or utilities. One of Scott's credit card balances was $12,000. Moreover, by November of 2002, Scott was only at 23% of his yearly goal for Trade Corp. Nenas admitted, however, that Scott always paid his credit card bills and car loan on time, and many credit cards carried a zero balance. The state relied on Nienhaus's testimony to argue that Scott was not doing well financially, which was a possible motive for him to kill his wife. But a closer look at their finances showed that Scott and Lacey typically spent less than they earned. Certified public accountant Marty Laffer testified that a review of Scott and Lacey's monthly income and expenses showed that they spent less than they earned each month. In fact, he noted that they paid extra on their mortgage each month. Prosecution witness and Trade Corp accountant Jeff Coleman testified that Scott was set to receive a monthly raise from $5,000 to $5,300 to $5,350 in January 2003. And the fact of the matter is there would be no financial windfall to Scott from Lacey's death. Although Lacey was set to inherit about $160,000 from the sale of her grandparents' home, she could not access the money until she turned 30, which was 3 years after her death. And if she died before the age of 30 and had no living children, then the $160,000 went to her brother Brent and sister Amy. It did not pass to Scott. There was also a separate Roker family trust worth $2.4 million from the estate of Lacey's grandfather. Under the terms of this trust, upon the death of Lacey's grandfather, the trust would be distributed to his 3 grandchildren, Lacey, Brent, and Amy. As was the case with the money from the sale of her grandparents' house, however, if Lacey died with no living children before the trust was distributed, her share went to Brent and Amy. It did not pass to Scott. In light of this evidence, Lacey's brother Brent acknowledged that there was no financial motive for Scott to kill Lacey. Lacey knew the provisions of the trust, and the state presented no evidence that she kept this information from Scott. Moreover, the notion that Scott killed Lacey because they were in dire financial straits is totally inconsistent with the fact that Scott paid her health insurance premium on December 23, 2002, the day before she went missing. With respect to life insurance, Brian Ulrich, a friend of Lacey and Scott, obtained his financial investing license in 2001. He testified that in April of that year, he gave Scott and Lacey a call to see if they were interested in financial planning. At this meeting, Brian recommended that they each purchase a life insurance policy. In April 2001, each purchased a policy for $250,000. After Lacey's disappearance, Scott never called Brian or his office asking about the life insurance money. Detective Puccini himself did not think that the life insurance policy was any motive for Scott to kill Lacey. The state's second theory as to motive was that Scott did not want to be a father. This theory was primarily based on the testimony of Brent Roker's wife, Rose, who recalled Scott once saying that he was kind of hoping for infertility, and Amber's testimony that Scott mentioned getting a vasectomy. Rose admitted, however, that Scott might have been joking, and Scott had not gotten a vasectomy. In fact, evidence from Brent Roker, Eric Olson, and Gary Reed showed quite the opposite. Brent testified that Scott was excited to have a baby and that one of Scott's goals was to have a family. Olson testified that Scott was happy about the pregnancy. Gregory Reed confirmed he had spoken with Scott many times about having a baby, and Scott seemed excited. Reed's wife, Kristen, was pregnant at the same time as Lacey, and all four had taken a birthing class together. Reed recalled that during Lacey's pregnancy, he and Scott had once looked through a hunting and fishing catalogue at the children's clothing section and joked about how excited they were to buy their kids that type of clothing someday. Finally, the state theorized that Scott killed Lacey because he wanted the freedom to pursue other relationships like the one he had started with Amber Fry. At trial, the state played numerous calls between Amber and Scott, which Amber had taped. Of course, to the extent that it was children Scott was trying to escape, then dating Amber was a curious choice, since she had a young daughter who lived at home with her. Perhaps recognising this, and during closing arguments, the prosecutor was candid. "I don't think Scott killed Lacey Peterson to go marry Amber Fry."